from Parasound, and I have the privilege of having a wonderful seminar with a very, very unique person, Michael Howe, VP of A&R at Warner Brothers Records. And we come to these shows and we see a lot of hardware, and sometimes we listen to pretty good music. But the opportunity to talk to somebody who is actually in the business, providing what it is that's the material that we use, is really rare, and especially somebody at his level and experience. I'm going to let Michael do most of the talking, but the nexus of consumer audio and the professional world is one of the things that he's going to touch on, and the value placed in audio, and then the relationship between the hardware and software. This is big stuff, and I hope that we'll get through it in the time. And I want to leave enough time so that you can ask questions directly of Michael. And with that, I think we'll start, and I'm going to just ask, so how'd you get in the business?
Well, thank you for coming, everybody. I really started as a musician. That was my first love and passion. And after realizing that I wasn't going to be a rock star and my band splintered apart, I decided that the next best thing would basically to be on the other side of the desk, but still have some connection to the creative community. So that's sort of what led me to the place where I currently am.
Okay. How long have you been there?
I have been in the creative world for record labels or publishing companies for about the last 20 years or so, since the mid to late 90s. And it's been a somewhat circuitous route from major label to performing rights organizations to indie label to publishing company back to the majors. I've touched on a bunch of different areas.
Explain what A&R is, people that don't know that.
The letters A&R stand for Artists and Repertoire, but it's basically, or some people say addictions and recovery, but some people say the thrust of it is basically to be the creative conduit inside the record company. So you're the point of contact between the manager, the artist, the producer, everybody who sort of does the creativity flows through the A&R person. I'm responsible for identifying young talent, signing it, helping to shepherd the creative process, and then being the internal champion once the material is delivered, so that the record company can then market it in a way that's meaningful and commercial.
Do you think our guests would recognize any of the talent that you've been involved with?
I suspect so. I've had the good fortune of having worked in some capacity with the Rolling Stones and Neil Young and Brian Wilson, and I was Prince's A&R guy before he died, and I still do a lot of stuff related to the Prince estate. Worked with Tears for Fears. I did some stuff with Tom Petty, R.I.P. A number of developing artists. It's sort of run the gamut from the most nascent developing stuff to the most iconic.
How did we meet?
We met through a guy I used to work with primarily because he was a big Parasound proponent and turned me on to everything that you are involved in, and I fell in love with the stuff and started a rapport with the people on your staff, and it's been sort of a love affair ever since. That was, I don't know, 10 years ago or something, and
yeah, and
we finally just met face to face.
And it's belatedly, and that's a privilege. Talk about where consumer audio, because that's what we build, fits in to your work.
It fits in very, very importantly because we think, as record company people, we think of the consumer as sort of the most important piece in the chain after the creative process. So the way that people are consuming and hearing the music and the emotional impact of that music is extremely important to us, considering we want to have an audience that continues to grow and expand. So the consumer level audio world is one of great interest to me and a number of other A&R people, thankfully, and other creative people in the industry.
Is this solely for your own auditioning, or does the talent have any exposure to the music that's being reproduced through this equipment?
Well, I take a lot of meetings, certainly, in my office with producers and managers and musicians of every stripe and other executives and entertainment attorneys, and what is coming out of the speakers and the equipment is the best representation of how I can contextualize something. So they are hearing my own vision, I suppose, for how the music will be consumed in a greater way.
So in this respect, it's a tool.
It is a tool
for you.
Yes, it is a tool, and a very important one. I mean, I spend a lot of time in studios, obviously, and there's a different, the pro audio world is a very different one in many respects to the consumer audio world, but the consumer audio world is of much more interest to me for the most part than the pro audio world.
Say a little bit more about that.
Well, I am most concerned with the emotional impact of the music and how I feel when I'm listening to it, not necessarily the exact replication or representation of the original event. I want to feel a particular way when I'm sitting in my chair listening to something, and I find more satisfaction doing that with consumer-grade audio than I do pro audio, which to me, for the most part, is very clinical.
Is this unusual in your industry?
Yes, I think it is a little bit unusual. I mean, I think most of the people that I deal with are probably listening in a slightly different way than I would, and are more concerned perhaps with sort of an absolute sound kind of environment than I am. But it's the emotion and the connection to the music that means the most to me, and that's why I got into it. I was a musician. I want to be close to the art. I want to be moved by the art, and this is the way to do it.
How would one communicate better the passion that is actually in the role that you play and how you interpret it? I don't know that people actually expect labels get to this level.
Mm-hmm.
How would people, our guests that are enthusiasts, and I'm assuming everybody here likes music as well as hardware.
Yeah.
I think people actually aren't aware of that. And how do you communicate it? How have you been communicating from Warner Brothers Records?
My own passion about the music itself, as opposed to just the commercial angle?
Yes. Well, the fact that there is somebody with that passion.
Well, I think that there are several people still within the major label system, and the major label world is can be a very difficult one in some cases for people who are most inclined toward the artistic process, because the worlds of the commercial world and the artistic world very infrequently collide in a way that is meaningful to somebody like me. So it can be difficult from time to time to pursue the things that have the most artistic meaning to me when I also have to be concerned with a company whose primary objective is making money. Sometimes those worlds intersect, frequently they don't. But I've been very fortunate, for the most part, to have worked with artists and pursued artists and made records with artists that have a special connection with me from an artistic place, and not just one from an overtly commercial place.
I'm going to save some time because I see a lot of questions forming in the group, and I want to ask Michael a little bit more. Where do you see the business going from physical media to non-physical media? And there's a lot of, obviously that's a major theme.
Yeah.
For us hardware makers.
Yeah.
What should we know about that we might not know from reading what we see in audiophile press?
Well, it's no secret that the streaming world has kind of changed everything from a commercial standpoint. I mean, the last 2 to 3 years particularly have seen somewhat of a leveling out of the immense amounts of attrition on the physical business, which was in free fall for a long, long time. Consumers are behaving in a way that indicates they will not abandon streaming at any time in the foreseeable future. So we're gearing a lot of strategy, particularly marketing strategy, around the digital world and the digital ecosystem, and how to unite what was traditional sort of record company marketing tactics with the emerging marketplace. We do a lot of vinyl production. That seems to, I don't think it affects the bottom line in a tremendously meaningful way, but there is a certainly a market for it, much more so than there was even 5 years ago. But we look at the marketplace and the deals that we're doing in much different ways than we did 15 years ago, where all we were concerned about was selling physical products. Didn't really care about taking pieces of publishing, merchandising, tour revenue, sync licensing. All we cared about was, selling the CD, and everything else sort of took a back seat. And that's when we were basically printing money. As that has changed completely, we're attempting to fashion deals that incorporate other elements of an artist's income, and not looking at the recorded music element, whether it's streaming or physical media, as necessarily the most important one, interestingly enough.
How large a part of the decision is made by the artist manager, whether you're going to issue something on vinyl?
A lot of it is down to the artist and the manager, and how passionate they are about that particular medium, and whether they think that their audience will consume it in a way that justifies the expense and the timeline and the moving parts, going from getting the master to actually getting a piece of delivered vinyl. A lot of vinyl sales happen on the road for artists, so they maybe buy a quantity at wholesale and then sell it for some significant markup on the road and make a lot of money that way. Retail, which has been obviously changed considerably, still stocks some vinyl, particularly specialty stores, and it's an important part for generally for the artists that I've worked with to have a relatively significant or robust vinyl component.
What would you predict the future for vinyl will be? Is it going to continue on the trajectory that it is? Is it going to become more intense or fall out of favor?
I don't think it'll fall out of favor completely. I mean, I think that there are a number of people who definitely appreciate the sort of tactile element of it, and the sound of it, and the the experience of flipping through the racks at a record store and smelling it, and the entire sort of the entire experience that surrounds vinyl. I think it's I don't think it's ever going to reach the heights that it once had. I mean, streaming, I think, is going to be really the thing that drives most consumption, certainly over the next 10 years, I would imagine. But I don't foresee vinyl disappearing completely. I mean, if anything, it will slightly increase, but I don't think it's going to recede in importance.
Excuse me, could I piggyback on your question? Michael, what percentage right now is Warner Brothers selling as vinyl? Percentage of products selling as vinyl, do you know?
Per title? It depends on the artist, I think, don't quote me on this because I don't know the exact figure, but I would say it is somewhere between 4 and 7% is my suspicion over, what's now known as sales plus streaming, SPS. So that means the entire consumption of a particular title.
Do you know if Warner Brothers is projecting an increase in that number in the future, or are they hedging their bet?
I don't know if they are if there's an increase projected, but they are certainly not slowing the production down, and we're issuing a lot of catalog pieces that have been out of print for a long, long time on vinyl, and those seem to be pretty well consumed. I mean, they're kind of flying off the shelves. So there's certainly a market for it. It's an expensive proposition. The margins aren't tremendously great on vinyl, but people buy it and people like it, and it's an important part of what we do.
So it's not going away.
It's not going away. Yeah.
Do you think vinyl sounds better?
It's a good question. Yes, to me it does, and I find it a much more satisfying experience than streaming for a number of reasons. I mean, I was a vinyl collector. That's how I started getting into music, was buying, saving up $6 to buy, Tattoo You or something. All I cared about was like records and baseball, and that was basically it, So, with the distractions that kids who were my age have today, it's hard to fathom the same passion in sort of record collecting. But because I have a history with it, and because because it's such a kind of a meaningful part of my life, it sounds better to me. Maybe it's my imagination, but I certainly enjoy spinning vinyl more than I do, clicking on a Spotify link, which is not a particularly satisfying endeavor.
I've got a pet theory. I'd like to know what your reaction is, and any of you. I think that vinyl does sound better to people, but not necessarily because of the technology.
Mm-hmm.
I think the experience of what you do is like a timeout in your routine. With digital media, you can get anything you want instantaneously without even a second thought, and you can probably do all kinds of other things while you're listening.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not separated from the rest of your day. And the phrase that we all know is that music, to an extent, has gone from a destination in our lives to an accompaniment. When I ask fellow manufacturers, some of whom I've known for many decades, what's the last time you went home and listened to a symphony? And the answer is, well, because I'm posing the question, you can guess what the answer is, but it's changed. So the reason that I think vinyl sounds better to people is the way our brains are wired. We're all descended from the little piggy that built the brick house, survivors, and rewarded for the work that we did. And so that work can be tweaking a system, it can be buying some enhancement, or the work done in vinyl requires, it's kind of like skiing. You can't be thinking about something else. If you're going to play a record, you start...
It's a commitment, for sure.
Yeah, well, you start with an anticipation
Mm-hmm.
of what you're going to do. Because you can't just do this, so you're going to have to do something.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to go to your library, you're going to find this physical media, which you have to handle carefully. You can't miss the cover art.
Mm-hmm.
And meanwhile, as this is going on, you can't be thinking of anything else. So this is kind of like a timeout
Mm-hmm.
from whatever else the day had before it. And the work involved is this: you've got to remove the disc, you've got to handle it carefully, you've got to put it in the platter, you've got to clean it, maybe dust off the stylus, gently put the stylus in the lead-in groove. All of this stuff takes concentration, and my opinion is it's building up an anticipation
Mm-hmm.
that wouldn't otherwise exist. And because then you get the reward for it, so I think it does sound better. But there might be technical advantages, but I think the way our brain is wired is that we do all these things, and therefore it sounds better.
I think that's a plausible theory.
Good.
Yeah.
Anybody else ever had that thought about just the distance you put on everything else? If you're going to, first of all, how many people here play vinyl? Just curious.
Do you find it more satisfying?
And what's wrong with you?
Yeah.
It's just the cost of it, the cost of entry.
Fair enough.
That's it. I'd love to actually get into it, but right now it's not feasible.
Yes.
From a hardware perspective, just out of curiosity, you mean the
Yeah.
analog front end stuff? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's the space requirements as well, and I'm not sure that the wife would think it's a particularly good idea either.
I've had that conversation.
I have experience listening to it, and it's an experience of actually, from when you decide to listen to something to actually hearing it, it has that extra bit that streaming doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yes?
What reason for stopping? You have the same amount of work between the CD and the vinyl.
Do you mind using the mic?
Yeah, you have the same amount of work involved in the same handling between a CD and vinyl. My complaint, and the reason I've just stopped with any kind of CD purchases or borrowing or whatever, is the mastering is different.
Mm-hmm.
They sound different.
Mm-hmm.
And it's they take the technical mix. Generally, this is where you get involved,
Mm-hmm.
from the recording studio, and they just put it on the CD digitally, and it's PCM, so what?
Mm-hmm.
But the vinyl takes another step with a mastering engineer. They change the sound. They make it sound, to me, better
Mm-hmm.
when they handle it. Streaming is going to be the same business with CD if it's PCM,
Mhm.
and it's not PCM, it's compressed,
Mhm.
and it sounds like crap. So, you know, you might
Could
as
you
well
address
listen
the
to my
different ways
phone
that the
speaker.
mastering is done for the vinyl and digital media?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are certainly engineers who are aware of the sort of brick wall effect and, attempt to back off of it in a way that is appreciably better than most, than most CD mastering, or what has become streaming mastering is. But vinyl, you're right, is a much more nuanced proposition for the most part. I think that there has been enough negative press about CD mastering and about the limitations of streaming, just the sonic limitations of streaming, that people in the mastering community are paying much more attention to it now. I mean, there's a big difference, if you're buying a frontline pop CD, versus a classical or jazz title that has taken much more sort of care and feeding in the process. So I think it's genre dependent. I think it's certainly mastering engineer dependent, and I think that there are probably people within record companies who have the ability to listen to the mastering process and tell them, and to recall the master before the commercial production element happens. But I do tend to agree with you that most CDs are pretty harsh, yeah.
How much does budget play into the extent to which the mastering is?
Not a lot, because the mastering process typically compared to the recording process is maybe 10% of the overall budget, maybe even 5%. I mean, mastering is not really an expensive proposition. So even doing it right, I don't think would break the bank by any measure. I mean, recording budgets have come down too, because the cost of making records has decreased somewhat dramatically thanks to home studios and the ability to do so much stuff on computers, and people learning how to make their own records, some of which are good, some of which are not so good. But mastering can be done well, without a big investment.
Is the decision who to engage for mastering joint with the artist? Is it decided by the label? Is it decided by the artist?
Generally, developing artists know very little about the mastering process, so that's typically something that somebody like me would recommend, and point to an array of what that mastering engineer has done and said, this is kind of the sonic spirit of what we're attempting to hit here. Do you want to use him or not? Guys like Neil Young or Prince or the Stones or whomever, have relied on specific people for a long, long time, and tend to use them over and over again because they have a level of trust that's kind of, ingrained, which is understandable.
On behalf of a label, what would you tell this group of people that they might not know that the label would like them to know, from whatever perspective?
Well, first of all, there are a lot of people at labels who definitely care about the music and are not driven only by the commercial element of what's happening. That there are very few people at major labels who can unilaterally make decisions about sort of what enters the marketplace. It's usually a lot of voices in the conversation, so by the time something actually hits the consumer, it has been, I shouldn't say tampered with, but there have been opinions that have sort of shaped the way that the final product actually emerges. So even if I have a vision about something, or a marketing guy has a vision about something, or take your pick of relatively senior executives, there's usually a compromise made, and the artist has at least at Warner's, has a big voice in that. It's not, nothing is imposed that is not, that doesn't feel like the right fit for the artist.
You've mentioned streaming a number of times. Do you perceive that there will be a way that streaming will be better than it is?
Yes, I think it'll be better in a number of areas. I mean, I think sonically, I think, bandwidth limitations are going to basically disappear at some point in the relatively foreseeable future, so that uncompressed streaming can become a reality for just about everybody. I think that the people who are entering the streaming companies in the streaming worlds are coming, a lot of guys are coming from record companies and and sort of speak the language of how to better serve the consumer. So streaming really was a bunch of tech guys trying to figure out the record business. Now there are a lot of record people who are drifting into the streaming world who I think can change the conversation so that the experience itself is a much more satisfying one. And I think that's starting to happen with meaningful playlists and positioning on the page and recommendations and a number of other things that just did not exist when you had to hunt and peck for something and there was no guidance whatsoever.
How many people here listen to music streamed?
Yeah.
And okay, so it's unfortunate, but you're doing it anyway. So
Because I want the music.
Yeah.
That's the reason.
it's the only way you can get it, or it's just because of the convenience?
No, it's convenience.
Mhm.
Yeah, you go to Amazon. You
Yeah.
can find anything easily because the way they index everything.
Does anybody? Yes.
Do you think that artists and probably like the public have a bit of a unreasonable expectation on like the return for artists from streaming? Obviously, like, there's this whole big thing that you have like hundreds of thousands of streams and you don't really get anything. But obviously, there's a big difference between getting something into Spotify than it is to get a record actually into a store.
Well, yes. I mean, I think they do. Artists for the most part now realize that you used to tour basically to promote a record, and the record was the real moneymaker. Now basically you put a record I'm generalizing. You put a record out to justify a tour, and that's where the money is made. So the the equation for streaming is something like 1,500 streams, equals the equivalent of one download. So it's, it's tonnage of streams basically, and not every artist is going to see any kind of meaningful return. Certainly in the streaming world, some do. I mean, and I think the satisfaction level is increasing, but it's, it's very much a river of fractions of pennies. It's certainly not. There's no one is really seeing a tremendous amount of money, I think, as a developing artist in the streaming world. I mean, if you're a superstar, it's one thing, or if you have, some kind of history. But, the baby bands of the world and the developing artists, I think, have a tough go in the streaming world. That's for sure.
Is it a similar kind of amount to what radio plays used to generate?
What radio plays used to generate? It's probably less per play is my guess. I mean, fractionally less per play, but a lot of people at record companies are viewing the streaming world as basically the new radio. So, being on the right playlist and being anointed by the other right artists and having some kind of very meaningful social media world and ecosystem built around you where people can kind of come in from all angles and stream SoundCloud, any sort of critical mass around the streaming exercise is viewed as very, very important. I mean, maybe in some cases more important than radio. If you're a frontline pop star, then radio is still extremely important. If you're somewhere on the fringes, it's tough to see any real return, or any real uptick from radio play at this point. It doesn't really move the needle. Alternative rock means very little, airplay. AAA doesn't mean that much. I mean, it's great to have people listening to you, but it's not really going to propel your career forward, I think, for the most part.
I just thought of something that's been bugging me now for the last 6 months. SiriusXM has stopped stereo.
It's a mono feed?
Yeah, it's almost all mono now. There's only like one channel, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
What that
What what do you think is their reason besides money, not having to pay RIAA and BMI in those fees, those rights fees?
Very easy. Most people are listening in their car.
Yeah, and that's where I want to hear stereo.
And you kind of got to vote.
You from the series?
No, I'm just saying as a consumer, I would a lot of times rather hear more.
No, there's got to be another reason why it's so prevalent.
Well, if they've got more.
Well, the other part is there's also a lot of radio content that was essentially mono that they're regurgitating.
Yeah.
I don't know what the answer to that is.
But they were broadcasting
you know.
in stereo, music in stereo, prior.
Are they trying to drive people to FM and stream?
They're probably introducing more channels, so they're trying to use the same bandwidth, so they
Well,
halve it.
technically, that's what I thought it was too.
Probably.
Yeah. But there's
It must be some bandwidth limitation. I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is. I didn't know that it was happening, and I don't know what the
Right.
business reason is. It's news to me. Yeah. I will let them know for sure.
Excuse me, I'll ask a rather naive question. I want to get back to the vinyl side of it before we get too far away from that. Does the major record companies, are you still actually doing the production of the vinyl, or you outsource that now?
Most of it is outsourced.
Okay.
In the case of Warner Brothers, the guy who owns the company, Warner's is the only privately owned major label of the three. There are three major label groups: Universal, Sony, Warner. Warner is owned by one guy who, from what I understand, has invested in 8 or 12 presses that are scattered around the world in some territories. I don't know exactly where they are. So technically, I suppose Warner's in some cases does its own production because the guy at the top of the food chain happens to own everything. But, you know, it's, for the most part, I think it's outsourced. And those plants are, you know, it's difficult to get vinyl done quickly because they're very,
Exactly.
very, very crowded.
I'm seeing the new vinyl presses are coming. There's one from Europe and then one out of Toronto, the Warm
Yeah.
Music, and I was just absolutely shocked where I saw that the fail rate on the current vinyl production was like 30%, 25, 30%.
It's high.
And
It's high.
And then these new presses, it's less than 1.
Yeah.
And then they're saying that one operator can operate 3 presses. So I was just a little bit taken back.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I was a little taken back and wondering if the record companies might go back into, you know, doing it more on their own or in-house, so to speak.
I mean, record companies will do anything that you know, generates money, basically.
Sure.
I mean, if the audience is there or the consumer is there, you know, and the appetite is there, we'll feed it, pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah.
And just one other thing on the vinyl, is there any advantage to having that, the cash transaction at the point of sale versus the streaming that
That's a
you're
good
seeing
question.
going forward on the business side of it?
No, I mean, at this point, no. The good, you know, one of the benefits of streaming as far as record companies are concerned is that it's, you know, sort of non-transactional. It's just repeat business. So it's the same equation over and over again. And I think, you know, it's viewed as a much stronger, you know, a much stronger element of the business moving forward than anything that would be a single transaction. That's why so many resources are being deployed to increase the streaming audience. Plus, you know, most people are now consuming music in that way. Yes.
Can you tell us what the forecast is for domestic vinyl sales for this year, and what the 5-year forecast is?
No, but I can find out, and I can take your information and email it to you if you'd like. I wouldn't want to speak off, you know, without having it in front of me.
I'm just curious to see what the rate of growth is, because it has been, I've heard numbers 30, 40%. I'm assuming that's going to be
Year-over-year growth you're talking about?
Yeah.
I think that's 30 to 40% seems high to me. I think it's at least 20.
I'm just
Wayne, what's your
wondering-
growth in vinyl-related hardware?
Actually, it's been fairly stable for the last 3 years, but price points have changed.
Just, Wayne Skirman owns Audio Advisor, who's got a rather big chunk of the business, so that's why I'm asking, because it's a big reflection in one place.
Yeah, it's been fairly flat, but price points have been moving up. So that's the change that we're seeing. But on the entry-level side, there've been a lot of distribution changes, so just staying even is a win.
Yeah. Are most people, just out of curiosity, are most of your customers buying $500 tables, or are they buying $2,000 tables?
Our entry point, our best-selling entry point is $399.
Which is the debut Carbon or something?
Right.
Yeah.
And then the next price point we're successful at is the range between 1,000 and 1,500. So.
Interesting.
There hasn't been a lot of activity between 500 and 1,000. So I think the $399 is the millennial, and I think
yes,
over $1,000 is the audiophile.
Yeah, or the person who was a vinyl consumer who wants to get back into the vinyl consumption exercise.
Right. They're definitely willing to step up and spend the money.
Yeah.
If the value is there.
Yeah.
You were trying to make a point.
I want to ask Michael a question. How in the last, 2 or 3 years has your role changed as all these other changes have evolved? I'm seeing Warner do better than ever this year. Has that been part of, Has your role been changed slightly because Warner seems to be doing better than they have in quite a while?
Well,
and is it that has to be guys like you finding better artists and promoting them better, right?
Yeah, I mean, Warner Brothers Records specifically is in the enviable position of having a pretty unassailable catalog. So the catalog is kind of an evergreen proposition for us. There are kind of two businesses: the catalog business and the frontline business. The role of guys like me has changed only to the extent that, generally speaking, there are younger people now who are in the frontline pop business, who understand the speed at which the market is moving and the vagaries of the pop marketplace, which is fickle, and immerse themselves in that in a way that guys who are generally, 40 and over don't. There are exceptions to that rule. There are a couple guys I work with who are very deep in the pop and urban worlds who are 60-year-old white guys, which is not common, but it happens. It's changed for me insofar as that world, this sort of very artificial track-based top 40 world, does not have a tremendous emotional resonance with me at this point, so I tend to focus my energies on other things that are still important to the company, but don't have me chasing after something that I don't have a particular sort of connection to from an artistic standpoint. Yeah, that's the most notable change, I think.
I have a twofold question relating to the Loudness.
I don't think that one's on. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a twofold question.
Hmm.
I have a twofold question
Yeah.
relating to the Loudness Wars. One, if you can speak to it, how did it come about and where is it heading in your view? And two, how much control do the labels have over that to begin with?
I think. Well,
I think Michael could do that.
yeah, I mean, the Loudness War, as I understand it, basically is the tendency for mastering engineers to master basically as loud as they can so that the compression is so pronounced that the supposedly quietest elements of the music and the loudest elements of the music are virtually indistinguishable. There's very little dynamic in the wave file. So I believe it started primarily as a tool for things to jump out at you on the radio, so that when the consumer is listening to Kiss FM, and something comes on and something comes on right after it that sort of explodes out of the speakers, the tendency is to kind of pay more attention to that. That was the initial, as I've been told, the initial reason that people were doing it. And then my only guess is that it continued because it seemed to work, and other record companies are like, well, why don't we do that? I mean, that seems to be the way that the that the consumer is reacting to the music. So it's sort of, sort of trying to outdo every step, and it gets to the point where it's really, in some cases, very, very unlistenable or extremely harsh. And yes, the record companies do have the ability to recall, like I've recalled masters and vinyl test pressings and things that I thought were inferior. But the artist also has a significant voice in that, and if that's how he or she or they envision it sounding, then we generally capitulate.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
I was disappointed in the latest live Stones album, for
Yeah.
example. It was really, really compressed, even compared to a lot of their
Yeah.
previous work.
Yeah.
I have a question. I agree with you that increased bandwidth has the potential
Mhm.
of improving the quality of streaming.
Mhm.
We've certainly seen some efforts, and I stream Tidal,
Mhm.
and I certainly enjoy the streaming experience through Tidal, or at least much of it. MQA purports to be another solution for
Mhm.
streaming quality. Is MQA part of Warner Brothers'
Yes.
strategy?
Yeah,
Could
it
you
is. I think we were the
speak to
first.
that?
We were the first, to sort of institutionally embrace it, and it seems to be well received. From what I can tell, I don't know how many consumers have been able to sort of ascertain that it exists. Quite honestly, I'm not sure that the message has gotten to the consumer level, but we have embedded the MQA technology in every digital file that we're releasing, and we are, I think, working through the catalog to do that as well. And I've spent time with it, obviously, because it's part of the the process of approving masters and whatnot. And generally speaking, I find it pretty compelling. I like it. I mean, I know there are a lot of detractors out there, but it seems in the, 50 A/B tests that I've done, the vast majority, maybe 45, are appreciably more involving to me with MQA than without. Yeah.
The dramatic decrease in CD sales over the past 10 or 15 years, can you foresee a time in the near future when the standard Red Book CD will be defunct as a medium? In other words, has it reached the point with recording companies where they're considering dropping the format?
I believe
You might restate the question for people in back that might not have heard.
Yeah, the question was, is there a time in the foreseeable future when the CD will basically be a completely dead format? I thought that we would have been there by now, quite honestly. But it seems that there is enough of a consumer that values the CD that they're still being manufactured in quantities that are for the most part much smaller than they were, but are still a part of the overall sort of marketing and commercial strategy. Maybe 10 years, I don't know. I think it would be. I think within the next 4 or 5 years, it will still be a very small part of the business that we're doing. But I'm surprised, quite honestly, that it has lasted as long as it has. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What else would you say to the enthusiasts regarding forecasting what the practices will be of the labels in terms of avoiding things like volume level wars as habituating people to a very perverted expression of music? And I know a lot of this rests in the artist who may or may not have a long view of what this consists of.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a robust conversation about this where you, within the limits of how you can influence an artist, try to keep this on the straight and narrow?
Yeah, I mean, there are artists that I work with who are much more cognizant of the sonic presentation than others. I mean, Neil Young, for example, it's no secret that he has been a proponent of high-res audio and even got into the hardware business with Pono, and has been long, long sort of proclaiming how important it is to basically have, the finished product as it was created in the studio or as close to what the artist intended it to be. There are other artists, I think, particularly younger ones, who don't really seem to be as bothered by what I would view, and probably most people in this room would view, as a greatly diminished presentation of what they intended. As long as people are listening to it, they don't seem to mind what how it is presented.
Is that because of the devices that they're listening to
Yeah,
it on?
I think it is.
Or
I mean, I think they've been.
multitasking and-
Yeah, I mean, my daughter, for example, is distracted, has 3 or 4 things happening at one time that never existed when I was, in her age and sort of consuming music. I would, go to the record store, I would buy the record, I would come home, I would put it on the turntable, I'd put the headphones on or sit in front of the speakers, and there was nothing else. No phone ringing, no video games, no other distractions. Lola, my daughter, is, like texting and listening to something and skipping the track and, like running outside to talk to one of her friends. I mean, there are just so many things happening in her orbit that take her away from the experience of the music, in my estimation. That the sonic element of it or the sonic integrity of it is probably not even on her list of things of importance.
Well, it's probably vying for her attention.
Yes, it is.
In which case, the Sonics are going to pander
Yes,
to that.
yes, agreed.
Do you see any hope for that changing? I mean, we'd have to be talking about the way millennials are wired,
Yeah.
and whether they grow out of it or it only gets worse.
I mean, I hope it changes. The few times, maybe not the few times, the times that I have been able to, demonstrate how a compressed file sounds and how how a master, uncompressed file sounds to people who have either sat in my office or at home, the reaction is uniformly one of, sort of jaw-dropping appreciation. So I think there's an education that has to happen with a lot of people who have only consumed compressed music. I mean, they know nothing else. They don't know what they're missing. And that pretty much was Neil Young's argument. You can't, convince somebody to embrace something that they don't know, how good it is, really.
So how do we accomplish it? Neil didn't actually accomplish what he was intending, and there was, money had a lot to do with it, and the pricing of it. But how does it get better? How do people that develop audio, that sell audio, reach these people? This is obviously a big question that's been around for a while.
My feeling is that you inject it into, in a non-invasive way, into the way that they are already consuming the music. So you introduce, as Tidal has, an option where you can hear an uncompressed stream, and I would say for the most part, people who listen, between the 256K and the uncompressed stream would, be much more inclined to listen, to the better of the two versions. I mean, I think it is a little bit of an education process, but it can certainly happen. I think also other emerging technologies, I don't know, virtual reality or augmented reality or some of the other things that are now starting to, have connective tissue with the music world could help change that as well. I don't know exactly how that's going to happen, but I think it will probably help.
Or make it worse.
Or maybe make it worse. Who knows? Yeah. Yes.
To add to that, you gotta include the theaters, the oldies.
Yes, right.
Idea, so visual
Yeah.
part of it. Not that there's anything on television, commercials on it.
Mm-hmm.
Doing that.
Mm-hmm.
But the other side, Netflix
Mm-hmm.
and Amazon, their increase in doing the Atmos
Yes.
playback and stuff, that will expose a lot of millennials to mobile audio.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the TV industry. I mean, now you can't get anything but high def. I mean, it's they've removed the inferior choice completely. It's not even a choice. They've removed it entirely. So I think we will have to get there at some point where there's no option, perhaps, to listen to a compressed piece of music.
But one of the things that would rain on your parade a bit is if you look at the wine industry.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think anybody that's old had any influence on convincing the millennials how the wine industry was going to go? No. They just basically told the wine industry to jump, and the wine industry said, how high?
Yeah.
And millennials drink lots of wine, and they make the experience going to a winery for the younger kids. They make that great. One of my favorite ones, they even have 2 standard poodles that greet people. And you just aren't going to really convince them to get something they don't want.
Mm-hmm.
Because they look at the thing and say, okay, the old guy screwed up the world.
Mm-hmm.
The Xers are worthless. And we're going to basically say what we want. And I think they'll get a certain point. But they're like Tidal,
Yeah.
there's no numbers that you can believe. But if you take the numbers that they said,
Mhm.
and then get them back down to reality,
Mhm.
there are not a lot of people streaming the high resolution.
No, I agree.
And
I agree. The penetration is not
the
high.
penetration's there. Spotify, well, let's see. We'd like to charge 10 more bucks for CD quality too.
Mhm.
They do a marketing study, doesn't work. How about 5? No. And so we're stuck at this $10 sweet spot.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
what? Mhm.
We can't get past.
Yeah.
And people are either going to have to bump certain kinds of things up and just accept 10 bucks, or leave it the way it is.
Yeah.
The consumer, who's not an audiophile,
Mhm.
that I see as kids, that are folks half my age and
Mhm.
further, they're perfectly happy with 256,
Right.
320.
Yes.
And of the audiophile people, I look at it and say, John Atkinson, a stereophile, released something in August.
Mm-hmm.
The MP3 and the iTunes version sound really good,
Hmm.
really good.
Mm-hmm.
So do you throw the money at the technology at that level and say, that's a good place to be? Because
I mean, you're talking about the downloads, right? The Apple Music Store, right? I mean, the download business
in
has
John
been.
Atkinson's case, yes. Otherwise, I'm talking about just streaming across.
Yeah.
When we're out playing golf, we're listening to Spotify.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. This is sort of the $64 million question. I think one of the main problems was that the record companies were, basically put blinders on when Napster emerged and, tried to ignore a problem that they could have embraced, and, we would be in a much different place, economically and from a technology standpoint now, had we done that. There were people inside record companies, in the nascent digital departments, which were relegated basically to closets when, these guys, nobody knew what the digital people were doing. We say, you got to pay attention to these guys at Napster. They have something, you're not going to litigate it away. People are actually using it. Why don't we, combine forces? But there was just an arrogance, I think, at the highest levels.
And in the
that-
smaller company, even where I would be semi-involved, they did not want to embrace certain kinds of tech stuff
Yeah.
at any point in time where it really would have made sense and you could have changed things.
Yes.
At your level,
Yeah.
for the better.
I agree. Yeah.
I don't work for Amazon, but I mentioned Amazon because the other day I was looking for a record,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a Billie Holiday.
He was looking for a. Yeah.
I'll give it back to you. It's turned on, okay. I was on Amazon, I was looking for something, and there was a bunch of records that were available on Amazon, and they were 99 cents to stream at MP3, 99 cents to stream it at PCM. So they, and there's a technical reason for this, because I also get involved with PCs and the technical side. Everybody's got to have servers.
Mm-hmm.
Now they're trying to make money with all those servers that they've got. And Amazon is the one that's got one of the biggest bunches of servers, even larger than what Apple and Microsoft have.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how they're starting to do it. What we need to do is need to look at what happens with Amazon with streaming the 2 levels, plus selling the record and the CD.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well, Amazon seems to have both Apple and Spotify in its sights at this point in the streaming world. It certainly has the cash and the reach to become a major player very quickly.
So the
That's for
background
sure.
music in Whole Foods is going to sound better than it does
That's
now.
right. That's exactly right. Exactly right.
Quick question. You've already told us that making sure the music is evolving is important to you, especially in your office while you're working. What sort of software and hardware systems do you use, and could you share with us?
Yeah, I use almost everything Richard makes. I use Eric's speakers, Tectons. I have 2 pair of those. I have a pair of Pendragons and a pair of double impacts. For the most part, I listen to high-res digital files just for ease of use. And I have just a regular MacBook Pro, and I have 2 or 3 different DACs, one of which is an Meridian Explorer 2 for MQA purposes. And I have I don't even know how to pronounce it, Shit Audio. Very inexpensive DAC, which is also quite good. I have the DAC that's built into the Halo integrated, which is awesome. I mean, that thing is unbelievable. I have a kind of a modded Technics 1200 table. And I don't listen to CDs really anymore at all. So it's primarily high-res digital or vinyl. And I occasionally listen to Tidal streaming, usually for MQA purposes, but it's mostly files that are stored, on an external drive. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
This is kind of a fun question for Michael. Have you been upstairs to see any of the equipment exhibits
Yeah.
here yet?
Yeah. I've seen a bunch of them. Yeah. I mean, there were 2 or 3 rooms that I thought were particularly good. One of which happens to be literally next door to the room that I was staying in, so I heard a lot of that. Which was the NOLA room. I thought those little boxers were good. Richard and Eric's room, both of Richard and Eric's rooms sound really good to me. The Martin Logan neoliths are pretty impressive from a sheer scale and standpoint. And I was in 2 or 3 others that I can't remember now that were very crowded, and I didn't have a chance to really sit down and spend too much time. But I like being here. I mean, it's nice to see, how robust the community is and how many people are, still interested in the, in the integrity of the sonics.
How many people are here for the first Rocky Mountain Audio Fest, if any?
Me.
Second? Third? Is your take that it's a good show? Does it feel good? Feel right?
Sir, I have 2 questions.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't mind me doing 2.
Sure.
I was a former disc jockey, and I was on Warner Brothers mailing list for 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciate all the vinyl you sent me.
Mm-hmm.
So the 2 questions are, what is it in the recording process that just makes some vinyl or CD just not have the sound stage and the depth, and what are they doing wrong in the recording studio? And my second question, real quick, is how come the SACD really never caught on?
I'll take them one at a time. The studio question can be, you can point to a lot of different things in the chain. I mean, the performance, for the most part, I think, is of paramount importance, and how that performance is captured. And there are people in studios who mic things very differently. There's, different outboard gear. There are producers who have very, very different ways of working. I mean, there can be, a relatively unlimited amount of variables that change the impact of what is coming out of the speakers. Where some things that seem very simple have tremendous impact, and some things that are, much more, you would imagine would be much more formidable, have very little impact. Are you telling us to cut time? Okay.
Seriously?
So I think it's, I think it's largely down to the engineer and the producer. I mean, if the performance is as good as it should be, and it's a master quality take, then it's generally an engineering choice. The second, the SACD, I really don't know the answer to that question. I have quite a few of them. I find them pretty satisfying for the most part, but I think it was probably a marketing exercise that didn't connect with the consumer, or the consumer didn't feel that it was, the step up in quality was, worth whatever the extra investment would be, and it just,
If I
tapered
recall
off.
correctly, it was not the best titles
That's
that
true.
were
at
released
first,
on
yes.
SACD. It was actually very disappointing and almost insulting, and I think that was at least one of the nails in the coffin for SACD.
And part of it too, I'm sure, was the very limited market. Most consumers don't care that much
Yes,
about sound quality,
correct.
way audiophiles.
Yes.
Very limited market.
Yeah. Do we have to stop?
Would go ahead, sorry.
Okay.
Can you hang around outside if
Absolutely.
any of our guests have other questions for
To
you?
be sure.
Would that be okay?
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.